"Have you seen the remote, Clifford?" Megan asked, her tone casual as she flipped through the channels. She was nestled on the couch, legs tucked under her, the glow of the TV reflecting off her face. "Check under the cushions," Clifford replied, not looking up from his newspaper. His reading glasses sat low on his nose as he scanned the headlines. It was their usual evening routine. Him with the paper and a glass of bourbon, her with whatever show had caught her interest. "Found it," Megan muttered, pulling the remote from between the couch cushions. She settled back in, clicking through channels with a disinterest that seemed more pronounced tonight. Clifford glanced at her over the rim of his glasses. She seemed distant, more than usual. There was a time when they would talk for hours after dinner, sharing stories about their day or reminiscing about old times. Now, silence often filled the space between them. He chalked it up to the years they'd spent together. Over 25 years of marriage had a way of dulling things. But tonight, there was a tension in the air that made him uneasy. "Are you coming to bed soon?" Clifford asked, folding the newspaper and setting it on the coffee table. "In a bit," Megan replied, her eyes not leaving the screen. "I'm just finishing this episode." Clifford nodded, though something in her voice didn't sit right with him. He stood up, stretching his arms overhead. The living room felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just him. He picked up his empty glass, the ice clinking softly, and carried it to the kitchen. As he rinsed the glass, he heard Megan laugh at something on TV, a sound that once warmed his heart but now felt distant, like it wasn't meant for him. He placed the glass on the drying rack and turned off the kitchen light. "Good night, then," Clifford said, pausing at the bottom of the stairs. "Good night," Megan answered, still not looking away from the television. Clifford climbed the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. The house was quiet, too quiet. Upstairs, he went through his nightly routine, brushing his teeth, washing his face, changing into his pajamas. As he moved around the bathroom, his thoughts drifted to the early years of their marriage. Back then, Megan would have been waiting for him in bed, a book in her hands, ready to talk about her day or ask him about his. He slipped into bed, the sheets cool against his skin. The space beside him was empty, and he felt it keenly. He missed the warmth of Megan's body next to his, the way she would snuggle up to him on colder nights. Now, she often stayed up late watching TV or scrolling through her phone. Clifford lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily these days, and tonight was no different. His mind wandered, replaying snippets of conversations from the past few months, little moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt loaded with meaning. Megan had been going out more often, dinners with friends, late meetings at work, weekend getaways with her sister. He'd never questioned it, trusting her implicitly. But now, he wondered. He tried to shake off the unease, telling himself he was overthinking things, but the feeling gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. "Stop it," he muttered to himself, turning onto his side. He tried to focus on the sound of the wind outside, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, anything to drown out the voice in his head that whispered of doubt and betrayal. But the thoughts kept coming, unbidden. He thought about the way Megan had been dressing lately. More attention to detail, new clothes, a fresh haircut. He told himself it was just a phase, something all women went through as they aged. But combined with her increasing absences, it felt like more. "Are you losing your mind, Clifford?" he asked himself, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. He rolled onto his back again, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The old fan whirred above, the blades spinning lazily. He could hear the TV downstairs still on, Megan's occasional laugh filtering up the stairs. It was almost mocking. He let out a sigh and rubbed his eyes. He remembered how they used to talk about everything. No secrets, no lies. They'd promised each other that. But now, there was a chasm between them, one he didn't know how to bridge. Clifford knew he should talk to her, ask her outright what was going on. But the fear of what she might say kept him silent. He wasn't ready to confront the possibility that something was wrong, that their marriage wasn't as solid as he'd always believed. The bed felt colder than ever as he lay there, sleep eluding him. The laughter from downstairs finally faded, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Megan was coming to bed. He closed his eyes, feigning sleep, not ready to face her, not yet. The mattress dipped as Megan climbed in beside him. She didn't reach for him, didn't say goodnight. She just lay there, silent, as if the space between them was a gulf too wide to cross. Clifford opened his eyes, staring into the darkness. Something had changed, something deep and fundamental, and he didn't know if they could ever get it back. Clifford jolted awake, a deep sense of dread pulling him from his sleep. The clock on the nightstand read 2:47 a.m. The bed beside him was empty, the sheets cold. His mind raced as he tried to piece together why Megan hadn't in the bed. He rubbed his eyes and swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Where is she?" he muttered, glancing around the darkened room. Reaching for his phone, he hesitated, then decided against calling her. Instead, he quietly slipped out of bed and made his way downstairs. The house was silent except for the faint glow emanating from the guest bedroom at the end of the hallway. Clifford's bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor as he moved toward the light. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the guest room. The soft, rhythmic sound of moaning filled the air, growing louder with each step. Clifford paused outside the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The sounds were unmistakable, filled with primal passion. He took a deep breath, fighting the wave of panic that washed over him. "What the hell?" he whispered to himself. Slowly, he turned the doorknob and eased the door open just a crack. The sight inside was like a punch to the gut. Megan was in the middle of the bed, completely naked, her body moving rhythmically. Behind her was Eric, their son's best friend, thrusting with an intensity that made Clifford's stomach churn. Eric came to their place for spend the weekend with their son. The shock of the scene left him rooted to the spot, unable to move, his mind reeling with disbelief and anger. Megan, sensing someone's presence, glanced up and met Clifford's gaze through the small opening. Instead of guilt or shame, a smirk curled on her lips, her eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. "I always preferred his Johnson over yours," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Clifford's breath caught in his throat, tears of anger stinging his eyes. He took a step back, his mind racing as he struggled to process the betrayal. Despite the crushing weight of the moment, a cold clarity began to form in his mind. He knew he had to act. "That's nice to know," Clifford replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. He pointed to the corner of the room where a small red light blinked. "You might want to take a look at the CCTV camera. Both of your parents are watching this live, and they're on their way." Megan's smirk faltered as she turned to look at the camera. The realization of what was happening dawned on her. Eric's face went pale, and he stopped mid-thrust, his body frozen in panic. The sight of Clifford standing there, unmoved and determined, was too much for them. Clifford pulled out his phone and quickly went for a video call. The phone rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. He held the phone up, making sure the camera captured the entire scene. "Hey, Amanda," Clifford said, his tone almost casual as he turned the camera towards the bed. "You might want to see this." Amanda's face appeared on the screen, her expression a mix of confusion and sleepiness. "Uncle Clifford, what's going on?" she asked, her voice heavy with fatigue. Clifford turned the camera to show Amanda the bed, ensuring she had a clear view of what was happening. "I thought you should know what your fiancé has been up to," he said, his voice cold and detached. "Take a good look." On the other end, Amanda's reaction was immediate and devastating. There was a moment of stunned silence before her sobs erupted, raw and heartbreaking. The sound cut through the room, amplifying the gravity of the situation. Megan's face drained of color as she realized the full extent of her mistake. She scrambled to pull away from Eric, desperately trying to cover herself with the sheets. But the damage was done. The scene had been exposed, and there was no taking it back. Eric, caught in the act, fumbled to cover himself, his movements frantic and disoriented. The terror in his eyes was evident. The weight of the situation had fully hit him, and there was no escaping the fallout. "Clifford, please don't," Megan began, her voice trembling as she tried to reach out to him, but Clifford cut her off with a cold, unyielding stare. Clifford slapped her across the face. "I trusted you," he said, his voice a low, harsh whisper filled with an icy rage. "Both of you," Eric stuttered, trying to form an apology, but the words were lost in the overwhelming shock. The reality of what they had done was setting in, and there was no escaping the consequences. Without another word, Clifford ended the call and turned back out of the room. He didn't want to hear their pleas or their excuses. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. His heart still pounding from the encounter. The sirens in the distance grew louder, a grim reminder that Megan's parents were en route. Clifford knew the arrival of the sirens was a matter of minutes. The weight of what had just transpired was heavy, but he could already feel the cold determination building inside him. He turned to look back at Megan and Eric. They stood together in the guest bedroom, their expressions a mixture of fear and shame. Megan's face was flushed, and Eric's eyes darted around, unable to settle on any one thing. The reality of their situation had begun to sink in, and Clifford couldn't help but feel a twisted satisfaction in their visible distress. Clifford's voice cut through the silence. "You think this is over?" His tone was low and menacing. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed." Megan flinched at his words, and Eric swallowed hard, his face turning an ashen gray. Clifford walked out of the room, leaving the door wide open behind him to stew in their fear. As he made his way back to his bedroom, he heard the distant wail of the sirens drawing closer. The sound seemed to underscore his resolve. Passing by his son's room, Clifford hesitated for a moment. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see David's silhouette sitting on the edge of his bed. Clifford took a deep breath and pushed the door open. David looked up, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. The reality of the situation was clear. He had overheard everything. "Dad?" David's voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with a mixture of shock and hurt. Clifford walked over and sat beside him on the bed, placing a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, son, but we're going to get through this together." David nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "I can't believe she would do this, with him of all people." Clifford squeezed David's shoulder. "Neither can I. But don't worry. We're going to make them regret every single moment of it." David looked up at his father, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. "What are you going to do?" Clifford's gaze hardened as he considered his next steps. "First, we need to face them. They need to understand the full impact of what they've done. Embarrassing them in front of their families and Amanda was just the beginning. I have a few more plans in mind." The sound of the sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of Megan's parents. Clifford stood up, his resolve solidifying. He turned to David. "Stay here. I need to handle this." David nodded, though his face was still etched with confusion and hurt. Clifford left the room and headed downstairs. The front doorbell rang just as he reached the foyer. He took a deep breath and opened the door to Megan's parents, who stood on the porch, their faces filled with concern. "Clifford, what's the fuck going on?" Megan's father, Robert, asked, her voice trembling. Her wife, Margaret, stood beside him, a look of confusion on his face. "Please come in," Clifford said, stepping aside to let them enter. Clifford saw the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Megan's parents storming through the house. Their voices, filled with a mix of disbelief and rage, reverberated through the halls. "Where is that bitch?" Margaret demanded, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Upstairs," Clifford called back, his tone steady despite the turmoil. "In the guest room." Margaret didn't wait for a second invitation. She charged up the stairs with Robert hot on her heels. Clifford and David exchanged a glance before following. As they reached the guest room, the scene before them was chaotic. Megan was scrambling to put on her clothes, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Eric, still half naked, stood by the bed, his face a mask of terror. The tension in the room was palpable. "What the hell is going on here?" Robert demanded, his face flushed with anger. Margaret, her composure faltering, looked like she might collapse. "Megan, how could you do this?" Megan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The enormity of her actions was sinking in, and she found herself unable to escape the harsh reality. "Mom, Dad, I can explain," she stammered, but her voice was weak and lacked conviction. Clifford stepped forward, his demeanor calm, but with an edge that made it clear he was far from finished. There's nothing to explain, Megan. They saw everything. The cameras recorded every moment. Margaret's face twisted with disgust as she turned to her daughter. You? With him? How could you betray your family like this? Eric took a hesitant step back, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Didn't mean for it to happen? David's voice was filled with venom as he stepped forward. You were supposed to be my best friend, and you do this to me? To my father? Eric opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His defeat was evident, and he stood there, completely at a loss for words. Get the fuck out, Clifford said coldly, pointing toward the door. Both of you, get out of my house. Megan's eyes were filled with desperation as she looked at Clifford. Please, Clifford, don't do this to me. I can. Clifford turned his back on her, cutting her off. Megan grabbed her clothes and hurried out of the room, her face flushed with shame. Eric, his head hanging low, followed close behind. As they left, Margaret sank onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling with sobs. Robert stood nearby, silent and motionless, his eyes fixed on the spot where his daughter had stood moments before. Clifford turned to David, his expression softening. Let's go, son. We don't need to stay here any longer. David nodded, still in shock. Together, they left the guest room and descended the stairs. As they reached the living room, David's voice broke the silence. Dad, what now? He asked, his tone reflecting the numbness he felt. Clifford glanced around the room, taking in the disarray left by the confrontation. We need to regroup. We'll sort through everything tomorrow. David rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the haze of shock. I never imagined it would end like this. Clifford placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Neither did I, but we'll get through it, one step at a time. Margaret and Robert remained upstairs, their sobs echoing down the hallway. Clifford and David left the house, the night air cool against their faces. The street was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just endured. As they reached their car, David hesitated before getting in. Do you think they'll ever understand? Clifford shook his head. I don't know, but right now, their understanding doesn't matter. We need to focus on ourselves. They drove in silence, the weight of the night's events hanging heavily between them. When they arrived at their destination, Clifford parked the car and turned to David. Get some rest, son, Clifford said softly. We'll face whatever comes next together. David nodded and slowly got out of the car, heading inside. Clifford watched him go, then sat in the car for a moment longer. The night had been a whirlwind of revelations and confrontations, but the road ahead was clear. They had faced the betrayal, and now they needed to rebuild and confront the fallout of their shattered lives. The days that followed the dramatic confrontation were a whirlwind of grief and anger. Megan and Eric had vanished, leaving behind a home filled with the echoes of their betrayal. The silence in the house was oppressive, but Clifford was far from idle. Amidst the chaos, he began crafting a plan to ensure that Megan and Eric would never forget the consequences of their actions. Clifford knew that merely exposing them wasn't enough. They needed to feel the full impact of their betrayal, to grasp the depth of the pain they had inflicted. He started by gathering David and laying out his strategy. David, Clifford said, looking his son in the eye, this is more than just about making them regret what they did. It's about making sure they face the consequences of their choices. David nodded, his face set with determination. I'm with you, Dad. What do we need to do? Clifford began outlining the details. First, we're going to start by reaching out to Amanda, Eric's fiancée. She deserves to know everything that happened, and we need her on our side. David agreed. I'll call her and see if she's available to meet. The next day, Amanda arrived at Clifford's house, her demeanor a mix of sadness and resolve. Clifford welcomed her and led her to the living room where they could talk privately. Amanda, Clifford began, I know this must be incredibly difficult for you, but we're in this together now. We want to make sure Eric faces the consequences of his actions. Amanda nodded, her eyes firm. I want him to pay. I want everyone to know what kind of person he really is. Clifford and Amanda spent hours sifting through evidence, texts, emails, photos. They compiled a comprehensive dossier detailing Eric's actions. Each piece of evidence was carefully selected to ensure maximum impact. They planned to release it to the media, exposing Eric's infidelity and deceit to the public. As they worked, Amanda's resolve strengthened. This isn't just about getting back at him. It's about making sure he can't just move on like nothing happened. Clifford agreed. Exactly. We're going to make sure he understands the full weight of what he's done. Meanwhile, Clifford also reached out to his lawyer, Susan. He needed to initiate divorce proceedings, and he wanted it to be as devastating as possible for Megan. Clifford, Susan said during their meeting, we can make this divorce as messy as you want. We'll start with a petition for dissolution of marriage and include a claim for the maximum amount of alimony and asset division. Clifford nodded. I want to ensure she loses everything, house, savings, the works. She needs to understand the cost of her betrayal. Susan's expression was one of professional determination. We'll make sure she doesn't get away with anything. We'll file for the divorce, and I'll handle the rest. As the plan took shape, Clifford felt a grim satisfaction. He had been pushed to his limits, but instead of succumbing to the hurt, he was channeling it into a strategy for revenge. Megan and Eric would be left to deal with the fallout of their actions, while Clifford and David would begin to rebuild their lives. David joined Clifford in the living room later that evening. How's everything going with Amanda and Susan? Everything is moving along, Clifford replied. We've got a solid plan in place. We just need to execute it carefully. David looked at his father, a mix of admiration and concern in his eyes. Do you think this will really make things better? Clifford sighed. I don't know if it will make things better, but it will ensure they face the consequences of what they did. We have to do this to find some measure of justice. David nodded, understanding the necessity of their actions. I just hope this brings us some closure. Clifford placed a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. It will. We'll get through this, and we'll come out stronger on the other side. As Clifford and David prepared for the next steps in their plan, the house was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was clear. Expose the betrayers, secure the divorce, and rebuild their lives from the ground up. They were ready to face the challenges ahead, determined to see their plan through to the end. The day of reckoning arrived swiftly and with devastating impact. The dossier on Eric was leaked, and it spread like wildfire. The evidence was irrefutable, showcasing his deception and infidelity. Clifford watched the fallout with a mix of grim satisfaction and detached observation. Eric's life unraveled rapidly. His once respected position at the firm became untenable as colleagues distanced themselves. The company's board held an emergency meeting, and within hours, Eric was officially terminated. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends and acquaintances, all expressing their shock and disappointment. One by one, people he once considered friends cut ties with him. The weight of public shame was crushing, and Eric was left isolated, his reputation in tatters. Amanda took full advantage of the situation, amplifying the revelations through social media and local news channels. She made sure that Eric's betrayal was well known, further ensuring that his fall from grace was complete. I want him to experience everything he made me feel, Amanda told Clifford during a call, her voice resolute. Good, Clifford replied. He needs to understand the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Megan faced the harsh reality of the divorce proceedings. Clifford's lawyer, Susan, pursued the case with an unwavering tenacity. Every argument Megan presented was met with a counter from Susan, and every attempt to delay the process was swiftly overruled. Megan tried to negotiate, offering to forfeit some assets, but Clifford was adamant. I want this to be final, he instructed Susan. Leave her with nothing. Megan found herself battling not just for her possessions, but also for her dignity. The court hearings were brutal, exposing her actions and decisions in detail. The once comfortable life she had taken for granted was slipping away. Each ruling, each settlement agreement, drove home the reality of her situation. Clifford was methodical in his pursuit of a settlement that would leave Megan with nothing but the weight of her choices. One evening, Megan, now moved into a small rental apartment, received an unexpected visit from David. The apartment was stark and bare, a stark contrast to the home she once enjoyed. The look on David's face was a mix of sadness and anger. David, Megan said, trying to maintain composure. What are you doing here? David stepped inside, his expression hardening. I needed to see you, to understand why. Megan looked away, her eyes welling with tears. I'm sorry, David. I never meant for any of this to happen. David's voice was firm, though it wavered. You didn't mean to? You tore our family apart for a fling. You threw away everything we had. Megan opened her mouth to respond but was at a loss for words. She had no excuses, no justification for what she had done. I don't know what I was thinking. David shook his head, his face a mask of disappointment. It doesn't matter now. What's done is done. Megan's shoulders slumped as she looked at her son, the weight of her actions finally settling in. I'm sorry, David. I'm truly sorry. David gave her one last look, then turned to leave. I hope you find a way to live with yourself. As David walked away, Megan was left alone, the silence in the apartment a stark reminder of her actions. The fallout of her choices was all around her. Eric's disgrace, her own financial ruin, and the fractured family. The consequences were undeniable, and she had no one but herself to blame. Clifford watched the final act of this drama from a distance. The satisfaction of seeing Megan and Eric face the consequences of their betrayal was mixed with a sense of resolution. The plan had worked, but the personal cost was steep. Clifford knew that while he had exacted his revenge, the path forward would be about rebuilding and healing, both for himself and for David. The day of reckoning had come, and it had left a trail of destruction. The fallout was complete, and Clifford was ready to move forward, determined to rebuild what had been shattered. In the weeks following the upheaval, Clifford and David settled into a new routine. The house, once a battleground of deceit, now felt different. The air was still, but it carried a sense of calm that had been missing for far too long. Clifford immersed himself in his work, focusing on projects and responsibilities that had once seemed secondary. He found solace in the routine of his job, channeling his energy into tasks that demanded his full attention. At work, colleagues noticed a renewed vigor in him, a testament to his resilience. He stayed late, worked on new initiatives, and found satisfaction in the accomplishments that were beginning to stack up. One evening, after another long day at the office, Clifford returned home to find David at the kitchen table, working for an upcoming project at his office. Clifford placed his briefcase on the floor and joined David, sitting across from him. Long day? David asked, glancing up from his books. Yeah, Clifford replied, rubbing his eyes. But it's good to be busy. How's the work going? David sighed, closing his laptop. It's going. I'm trying to stay focused, but it's hard to forget everything that's happened. Clifford nodded. I know, son. It's not going to be easy, but we'll get through it together. They talked for a while longer, discussing David's work and Clifford's latest projects. The conversation was casual, a stark contrast to the tension that once filled their interactions. It was clear that while the pain was still there, they were finding their way back to each other. Meanwhile, Megan and Eric were dealing with their own consequences. Megan had moved into a small apartment in a less desirable part of town. She tried to reach out to old friends, but many had turned their backs on her. She spent her days in a job she had never envisioned for herself, barely making ends meet. Her once affluent life was now replaced with a daily struggle to make it through. One day, Megan called Clifford, her voice hesitant but desperate. Clifford, can we talk? I need to explain something. Clifford hesitated before answering. What's there left to talk about, Megan? I want to apologize, Megan said. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Clifford's voice was calm but firm. Sorry doesn't undo the damage you caused. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. Megan's voice cracked with emotion. I know. I needed to say it. Consider it heard, Clifford replied, ending the call. He didn't need to dwell on the past any longer. He had taken control and moved forward, and that was where his focus would remain. Eric's situation was equally dire. He was struggling to find work, his reputation making it nearly impossible to secure a position in his field. The social circles he once frequented had closed ranks, and he found himself isolated. Amanda had taken legal action against him, seeking compensation for the emotional distress he had caused. Eric had lost almost everything: his career, his relationships, and his future. As Clifford stood by the window one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. He had survived the storm, and now, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, he felt a small but genuine smile cross his face. Clifford had faced the worst and emerged stronger. He had rebuilt his life, solidified his bond with David, and found a new sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but he was ready to embrace whatever came next.